All right. Let's get this thing cracking. So this is my second video on systemic racism, and I checked my video stats yesterday, and I saw a grand total of 14 people learned the truth of systemic racism. So it's got to start somewhere, and I know what a lot of you are thinking. Maybe, what is this white boy talking about systemic racism for? That looks like this. Well, it's kind of appropriate for 2020, the year we're in, for something strange and unexpected like this to happen. But the truth of systemic racism, I believe, has been misinterpreted and miscommunicated, not intentionally, just because we haven't been looking at we haven't been looking at the wrong level of analysis. We've thought it was embedded in capitalism or Western values or these other systems. The bug of systemic racism has affected these systems, but systemic racism is not caused by capitalism or other Western kind of values. It's caused by something rooted deeper in our psychoevolutionary history, and that is a fear response, or predator recognition response. This is a review from my first video, which will be linked in the descriptions, which you should all watch regardless. It's a good, but a review is the media, the peers, experience, also history kind of glazed over all this, creates a fear response in cops, predator recognition behavior. Cops interpret that involuntary, that's important here, involuntary predator recognition behavior. It could be like a furtive glance, evasiveness, changes in body posture. It's interpreted as criminal behavior, and that is just a feedback loop that keeps this whole kind of thing going. And that results in a fear of powerlessness. And then we have these pressure points. Back when I was a teenager, it would have been, Rodney King, and now we had the Floyd situation, and there was things escalating into that. That gets fed back into civil unrest, and then also there's splinter factions coming off of powerlessness into separatist movements that feel it necessary to break down and reimagine the whole entire system. They're on the wrong path because they've misdiagnosed the problem, what causes systemic racism, something embedded, it's common to all people, this predator response. It's common to all mammals. We have it, and it's been hijacked through our media, through peers, through experience. I saw it, I heard about it, maybe I even experienced something that solidified these neural pathways. And so that gets also fed back into the larger, parentheses, white culture, which is not entirely white as you might imagine. You can say this is the dominant culture, the mainstream culture. From their media, from their peers, from their experience, from video of civil unrest, they get a fear of blacks and Hispanics that also gets hardwired into their brains along the similar path that fear of cops gets hardwired into the brains of blacks and Hispanics. That creates a predator recognition. Hillary, HRC with her hyper predator, apex predator, was a bit of a Freudian slip, and probably speaking more truth than she even realized, how that predator recognition gets enmeshed in the brain. Again, what's in these three boxes doesn't have to be the truth, and could often be a lot different than the actual truth. What matters is what gets enmeshed in your brain cells. So, to the Ben Shapiro's of the world, to the Sam Harris's that look at this problem just through the lens of they're crunching data, they're just trying to look at the numbers to piece apart where is this police brutality, systemic bias. It's not the proper way to look at the problem. The proper way is that it's a hijacking of our internal laws and regulations. So this is one example where feelings actually do trump facts, regardless of how much factual materials in these boxes. And so, unlike the smaller, Black and Hispanic communities, the larger culture can wield their fear or have their fear manipulated into actual political power. And also, as over here, there's this split off separatists. This would be the capital R racists. This is all lowercase r, systemic racism. Capital R racism would be your actual hardline racists that want to separate nation or nation state based on race. And we all have the R, the small r in us. We are, as I will show you, actually enabling this whole system continue. Even the people who fight the most hard against destroying system racism are actually helping engender this whole system. So political power initiated, some split off into separatists, the big higher case R. And these were people that actually would have felt glee at witnessing like the George Floyd video, which, I watched the whole video. Glee was not the emotion that came to mind. And for the vast amount of Americans, that was not the experience, the emotional resonance they got from that video. So the good news is most of America is not in the hard R category. We all are infected with this small r of systemic racism. So civic top-down control enacted, and that is kind of the fear-based politics of, stop and frisk, 3 strikes, differential drug laws, stuff like that. And that also gets then fed back into the system, which just further keeps this whole snake-like apparatus going. And a snake eating its tail is the proper analogy here. Ouroboros from Egyptian mythology, symbol of death and rebirth, also a symbol of self-destruction. So which way do we want to go? The way of self-destruction or the way of rebirth, the snake shedding its skin? So you could do with that what you will. And again, putting this in the proper context of the three acts of racial justice: emancipation, civil rights, systemic racism. Each one blockading down into a smaller kind of system recognition. Country, then the states, then going into our own internal mammalian hardwired neurochemistry. And again, this is how a lot of systems works. Systems of, you might say, oppression. Here's a similar flow chart for describing Trump derangement syndrome. You could also use this for conservative bias. So if conservatives, people leaning to the right, recognize Trump derangement syndrome, it's formed along the same pathways that systemic racism is. So if you believe in systemic racism and you believe the pathways I've laid out here, then you also have to recognize Trump derangement syndrome, conservative bias, and vice versa. If you're a conservative and you recognize there is bias and you recognize there's Trump derangement syndrome, you also have to, by default, take on board what that means for systemic racism. Again, we're all in this system. All of America has the small r. We've been infected with it. You don't want it to turn into the big R. That's the key here. And we can diminish the small r, maybe even extinguish it by recognizing this pathway. What has gone wrong is that any squish or pressure on either side creates an opposite reaction on the other side. So they're linked. There's a linkage here. So any pressure here is going to create a pressure over here in the way this is constructed. So what is needed on the larger kind of white culture, mainstream culture, Again, a lot of people that are not white are in white mainstream culture. And what I believe is needed over here is an honest appraisal and recognition of the fear of blacks and Hispanics, or whatever group you have your fear response has been hijacked by. Again, it's not a native, natural born fear. It's been taught to you through media, peers, experience, with a glaze of history over top of it. So the white separatists, they want you to believe this small r is innately born into you. So for those of so this is a way to defeat the big R separatists, is to push back against the notion that the small r is native to our brains. The fear response is that's been hijacked. Okay, so what is needed over here is basically allowing white and mainstream culture the openness and, you might say, safe space to honestly come to terms with and express the fear they've been taught. Okay, that's a really big part of it. We don't have it because we have freedom of speech in law, but not in practice. And that is part of the, could go over here, the powerlessness by which censorship, conspiracy theories, confirmation bias occurs in this revolt against the red states, deplorables, whatnot, the deplatforming, the doxing, their own fear response is making it next to impossible for white culture to admit to having any instilled fear of blacks and Hispanics. Because it's been assumed that if you have fear of these groups, it's because you're racist, capital R racist. It's not actually. You've been instilled with this fear, this small r, and you can't talk about your fear, which means you can't confront it and deal with it and quelch it, which just keeps the whole system going. So again, the ways of the cancel culture movement, getting people to lose their jobs, doxing them, this is actually contrary to making progress to actually get rid of systemic racism. So for those that want to destroy systemic racism, the methods they're using is actually engendering the furthering of this system. Because we all are infected with the small r. Small r, systemic racism, big R, actual hardline, violent, aggressive, separatist, racist movements. This also means, and we've seen this increasingly over the last couple of years, that the job as I see it of comedians, entertainers, they've lost their job because of this cancel culture, politically correct mentality. So the job of comedians was actually to relieve stress in this whole system, which they kind of had been doing. We knew there was a problem, but comedians, I think, kind of kept the rails kind of oiled well enough to keep going. So, hey, maybe it's a good thing that we had to get rid of the comedians in order to really see what the root of the problem is. So yeah, freedom of speech is embedded and emboldened by getting at systemic racism. And the methods of quote unquote the progressives, the cancel culture, SJW tactics of canceling people, of getting people deplatformed, of showing up at their houses, that's actually having a negative effect on destroying systemic racism. Systemic racism is a bug, a fear bug in the system. Historical racism is there because this fear bug was always there. We were the same animal species back then, and this predator recognition was also being hijacked in history as well. And then that through civic control of the mainstream, they could legislate their fear into law, which just kind of exacerbates the whole situation. So that's about it today. I hope you got something from this. I hope you share it. I'm unemployed. Patreon always helps, and yeah, spread the word. This is the times we're in, so expect more weirdness from me and from the universe. Bye-bye.